Hey everybody, this is Mr. Storm, and in this project we are going to build our own version of the game Snake. I'm sure you've played Snake before. That's the game where the thing goes around and it gobbles up the food, and then it gets longer, and if it hits itself it explodes, and if it hits the wall it explodes, and all that. We're not going to build the full game though. We're going to build just enough of it so that we can essentially reinforce the concepts that you learned last week and learn a new concept called prefab or prefabricated objects. So I have my Unity Hub open here. I'm going to go ahead and click New. I want to make sure I select 2D. This is a 2D project. I want to name my project something fun. I'm going to call mine Snake Mr. or let's say Teacher Edition. All right. It's going to go to my game design folder where I store all of my game design projects on my computer, which that D drive is actually getting pretty full. I might want to swap that out for a bigger drive later. Anyway, and I'm going to click Create and readjust myself here in the chair. All right, Unity is going to take some time to open up. In the meantime, let's talk about some of the concepts that we learned last week. So last week, we learned that everything in a video game is essentially an object, right? And objects are, they can be anything from your main character to enemies in your game to power-ups to whatever you have. Even the floor of your game, the walls of your game, those are all objects. Now, objects have a bunch of different things attached to them. These things are called components, okay? So if I have an object, I'm going to have a component that probably renders a sprite or essentially adds artwork to that component. Ah, beautiful. Unity's open. I didn't even get through my review before it opened. This is nice. So anyway, so that object is going to have components. So this, for example, my main camera object has components. It has a transform component, it has a camera component, and it has an audio listener component. Those components add functionality to this object. So for example, my main camera's camera component allows me to do things like change the background, which we're going to do right now. So if you're following along at home, set it to be a black background. Now, I like a black background for these old school video games because it looks really good against the white artwork that we're using. But if you want to use something different, it's completely up to you. This is your game. Have fun with it. So there we go, black background. We will resize the camera once we bring in our art assets so that it's the right size. Okay, that's it. That's all we have to do for the camera, it looks like. So here's what we're going to do. Let's bring in our art assets. So if I move Unity over a bit, you can see over here on my desktop, I've already downloaded and extracted the Snake Resources folder. So if you have only downloaded but you haven't extracted, I know some people had an issue with this last time. So if you go to, say for Snake Resources, this is the extract folder or the zipped folder. And if I look up here, it says extract. Now my version, oh, that's way too big. The compressed tools that I use are going to be different from the ones you use. If you're in the computer lab, when you double click on a zip folder, it's going to show up with a panel, a window essentially, and you will see some buttons up here at the top. The one you're looking for is extract. It's a blue minus. If you click on that, it will allow you to extract the resources you need. So once I have those extracted, they're going to be in here. I have some art, so a horizontal border, a vertical border, a food object, and a snake object. And then I have a couple of scripts here. I'm going to create a new folder in the Unity Assets folder. I will call this Sprites. And in my Sprites folder, I'm going to bring in all of my artwork. So I can just drop it right in there. Oh. These food objects are really, really tiny. Make sure you're grabbing the food itself. Okay. And then in my assets folder, I'm going to create another folder called scripts. And in there, I'm going to do this. Oh, not that. That. And there, I'm going to bring in. Oh, hello. There we go. So those are my scripts for the game. So I have scripts in there. I have sprites in there. And let's see. Yep, that's about all I need to do right now. I have all my resources. Believe it or not, with just these 4 sprites and these 2 scripts, we're going to create a snake game. And you'll see very quickly how easy this is going to be. Okay, let's go ahead and set up our artwork so that it can be added to our scene. Let's start with the border horizontal. So we want to set the pixels per unit to 1. And we want to turn off the filter for the artwork. We do not want the artwork being filtered in any way. So pixels per unit 1, and we turn off the artwork. And then we can drag in 2 copies of this border horizontal. And that's pretty huge, right? Those are big. So we're going to have to adjust our camera a bit. All right, let's fix our vertical by again changing the pixels per unit and turning off the filter. And we'll bring in 2 of those as well. So now we have all of the objects we need to create a border, but we don't actually have them in the right place. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select both of my horizontal pieces by clicking one, holding Shift, and clicking the other. And over here in the position section, I want to set them both to be 0 on the X position. That means it's going to center them horizontally, right? So they're both horizontal. It's going to center them on the X axis. And I want to do the same with the vertical pieces, except I want to center them on the Y axis. And they were pretty close to being centered on the Y. All right, so now I can tell that these are almost in the right place, but these definitely, so this wall definitely isn't. So if I look, I'm at negative 31.5 yada, yada, yada on the X. So I want to move that. And what I can do is I can just hover over the X here, and I can click and just drag it to the right to just change where that position is. Instead of having to fine tune and actually type in the numbers, I can actually just click and drag. So put that roughly in the right spot. Put this roughly in the right spot. And it looks like I do have to move this in just a bit. Okay. Now it looks like we're good. This might be just a little, oh, too far. All right. And see, now I don't like it. I want to go back just one more. All right, that's fine. That'll be fine. So that's my border, or that's my boundary right there. Now, as you notice, my camera is very, very small. So I'm going to grab that and just scale it up until I can see my play space in my camera. Okay, so now that we have our border set up, I want to do something very quickly. It's going to save us some time later on. I want to rename my border walls so that they actually are named what they should be named, right? So for example, this is the top of the border. This is the top border. So I'm going to rename this to border top. I will rename this border bottom. I'll rename this to border left. And I will rename this to border, border right. Oh, hello. Right. There we go. All right, so now my borders are all named properly. I know which one I'm going to select whenever I select them. Okay, so now we have that all set up. Next, we have to get our food ready. Now, we don't want just one piece of food on our screen, right? We want our food to be able to spawn periodically within our game. Because if you've played Snake, you know that food will spawn randomly in the play space at a certain interval of time, and the snake has to go over there and eat the food, right? So if we come over here and look at our scripts, and I check out my spawn food script, there's all this gibberish over here, right? Well, in this gibberish is code that will spawn the food every 4 seconds, starting at 3 seconds. So it'll wait 3 seconds, then spawn some food, and then every 4 seconds after that, it's going to spawn food again. And that food is going to be spawned within a random range between the border left and the border right position, and a random range between the border top and the border bottom position. And it's going to instantiate a food prefab. It's going to instantiate something called the food prefab. Now, all we have right now is a sprite called food. Well, we need to create a prefab out of this object. So here's how we do that. First, we have to set up the food sprite so that it will fit within our game. So pixels per unit is 1. The filter will be turned off. We're going to hit apply. And now we're going to drag this food sprite out into the game space to create an object. Now we have a food object. Now I'm going to rename this food object food prefab. Now, it's very important that you type it exactly the way I typed it. All right. Our snake script later on is going to check to see if it's run into a piece of food named food prefab. If it's not named exactly the way that I wrote it, then it's not going to pick up the food. It's going to go right by it, and it's not going to get any longer, and the food's going to stay there. So some of you are going to get to the point where you're testing your game and it just doesn't work because your snake passes right through your food. Check to make sure that you have named your food prefab with a capital F, no space between food and prefab, and a capital P. All right. So one thing that this food prefab needs is something called a trigger. Okay. So we talked about colliders in the Pong game, where you can add something around an object to make it so that so that other solid objects that have a collider won't move through it, right? Well, we need to add a collider to the food prefab, but we want things to still move through them, right? I want the food to be there, and I want my snake to be able to move through the food, but I want it to trigger some kind of action whenever those colliders touch, right? So we're going to add something called a trigger. We're going to add a component, and we're going to look for a box collider 2D. And once we have that component attached, we are going to check this box that says is trigger. That means we can now move through it because it's a solid object, or we can move through it. It'll behave as if it's not solid, but when the snake's collider intersects with the trigger attached to the food, it will trigger something in the code, right? And for example, in the spawn food script, or actually in the snake script, if we look here on trigger enter, whenever it collides, it's going to check to see if the name starts with food prefab, right? So that's why it's important to name your food correctly. If it does, then it's going to set 8 to be true, and then it's going to eat the food, right? Okay. Let's see. Okay. Okay, so I think all we need is the trigger attached to the food prefab. Now we need to turn this into a prefab. So how we do that is we go back to assets, we create a new folder, we call it prefabs. We'll open that folder, and we drag food prefab from the hierarchy down into that folder. Now notice that the food prefab object up here turned blue. That means it's a prefab. And there's this little arrow next to it. If I click the arrow, it will take me into the prefab editor, which will allow me to make changes to the prefab. I can go back here, back to the scene. So now that we have this food prefab down here, we can get rid of the instance of the food prefab in our game, because this thing, now we can generate as many copies of the food as we want. Now, copies isn't the right word. Really, these are instances of a prefab. We can instantiate as many instances of this prefab as we would like. We don't want anything here yet, though. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of those. Okay, so now we have a prefab for our food, but the food doesn't just come in on its own. It doesn't just randomly get generated, we need a script to handle that, right? And so we've looked here earlier, we have a spawn food script. So how do we get this to work? Well, watch this. We need to attach the script to something, but we don't want to attach it to anything that's going to get deleted from our scene. We also don't want to attach it to anything that is important for our game to run properly, because we don't want to interact with any of the other we don't want it to interact with any of the other things that are running. So usually with something like this, we attach it to an object that's stationary that won't move, like the main camera if our camera doesn't move. The other option we have is to create a new empty object and call it game controller. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to create an empty object, which is an object with only a position. I'm going to set this to 0, so it's right in the middle of the game. It's going to be invisible because we do not have a sprite renderer component, and it's not going to be manipulated by physics because it doesn't have a rigid body 2D. We're not going to be able to collide with it because it doesn't have a collider. It's literally just an empty game object. And instead of game object, I'm going to rename this and call it game controller. What this is going to do, or game engine, game manager, you can name it whatever you want. I think game engine. One of these. No, maybe not. One of those keywords, I believe, used to create a different icon here. Instead of the box icon for object, it created a gear icon, which let you, anyway. So we can call it whatever we want. We just need an object to handle this. I'm actually going to rename, I'm going to call it spawner, because that's the only thing we want it to do is spawn. And I'm going to attach this spawn food script. So I'm going to drag it over here. Now we can see that we have a ton of options here that we need to fill in. We have a food prefab option. So I'm going to go to my food prefab in my prefabs folder, and I'm going to drag that over and just drop it in that space. So that is the object, or that's the prefab that we're going to instantiate every 3 seconds or every 4 seconds. Then we have border top, border bottom, border left, border right. These are the borders, right? What this is going to do is these are setting the objects which stand in as the absolute barriers or the edges of the playable space, so that my food prefabs won't instantiate anywhere outside of those borders. Okay, once those are all filled in, we can actually test our game. But I'm going to save it first. Let's save. And save project. And we can actually test our game out. So it doesn't look like anything's happening, but right there. So 3 seconds in, we start getting food. Now notice the food is spawning in random places, but it's not spawning outside of the game area, right? Because we've tied it, the script keeps it inside of here. And notice that whenever a new food prefab gets instantiated, it comes in with this word clone on the end. That's why our script is looking for the beginning of the name, not the whole name itself. Beautiful. Okay, so our spawner script is working perfectly. Okay, now we need a main character. We need something to interact with, because right now this game is fine, but it just generates random colored dots on my screen. So let's actually create our main character. Here's how we're going to do it. Let's go back to our sprites. Let's grab our snake. Set this to 1 pixel per unit. Set it to turn off the filter. Hit apply. And let's drag out an instance of our snake. I'm actually going to set it right dead center. So 0 on the X, 0 on the Y. Now, this snake object is actually just going to be the head of the snake. So I'm going to call this head. And we want, essentially what we want to do is just generate or instantiate a section of the tail whenever food is eaten, right? So we need to create a prefab for the tail. So let's go ahead and duplicate this object and rename it. Oh, actually, let's delete that. We want to add some stuff to it first. So the head is going to need a 2D box collider. This is not going to be a trigger. It is actually a collider. And it also needs a rigid body 2D, because the head is going to move around in our scene. Now, with the rigid body, please remember to turn off your gravity. So set your gravity scale to 0 and change your constraints. Freeze the Z rotation because we don't want our heads spinning around. Okay. Beautiful. Now we're going to create a duplicate of the head. Oh, no, not rename. Let's duplicate. And we're going to rename this to tail prefab. And then we will turn it into a prefab by dragging it into the scene or into the assets folder or the prefabs folder. Notice it becomes blue. That means it is now a prefab. And I'm going to delete it out of the hierarchy. Okay. Now the last thing we have to do is attach our snake script to the head. So I'm going to do that here. And let's take a look at the script itself. So the script is only asking for one new thing, which is the tail prefab. That is the thing that we just created, the tail prefab. I'm going to drag that in there. Okay. At this point, believe it or not, our game is actually built. Now we can test our game, make sure that our food is getting gobbled up, and make sure that our snake works the way it's supposed to. Let me go ahead and test it. Okay, my snake's moving pretty well. And notice there's food, and I can move my snake. Let's see if I can gobble up the food. I do, and look, my snake grows by 1 whenever I gobble the food. Let's go eat some more food. Okay, this is a very slow snake game, by the way. Again, this wasn't really meant to be fun. It was more meant to learn how to use prefabs effectively. Okay, I got some food. Let's see what happens if I run into the wall. Oh, I go right through it. Uh-oh. Let's see what happened there. Did I forget to add? I forgot to add colliders to my walls. Let's do that. I'm glad I tested that out because I completely forgot that component. Box collider 2D. Yeah, let's add those. And let's try this out again. Let's test it again. That's embarrassing, but you know what? People make mistakes. All right. Come on, slow snake. Let's see what happens when you collide with a wall. Nothing. Okay. Beautiful. I want to check my script really quick. So on trigger enter, oh. Okay, let's set these as triggers. How about that? So these, we're going to set them as triggers as well. Okay. So I'll be able to pass through them, but the script should catch it and make me lose the game. So let's find out if that works. Nope. How did I write my script? Oh, it's in the to-do section. That was something I was going to implement later, but I never got to. That's okay. Let's go ahead and turn these back into strong colliders. Turn the trigger option off so that at least our snake collides with the wall. Now, if we wanted to, I could write a little addendum to the script that made it so the game started over or gave you a game over screen. But honestly, at this point, you've learned really what you need to learn. You know how to make prefabs. You know how they work. You know how to instantiate them, or at least use scripts that instantiate them. And hopefully you understand why prefabs are important. So now that you're done building your game, what we're going to do is we're going to turn in the build of this game. So we're going to go to build settings. Make sure you're outputting your game. The platform is PC, Mac, and Linux standalone. Make sure you have the sample scene, which is the scene we've been editing here, selected. I'm actually going to save my game. Save. And save project. Then go back to build settings. Make sure the sample scene is selected. And go ahead and click build. Now for this, I'm going to put it on the desktop. And I'm actually going to create a new folder called Snake Build so we can put all of our files that get created with the build inside this empty folder, and I just have to zip that one folder together. So I'm going to click select folder. It's going to take a couple seconds, build my game, and then I'll be able to play it and see how it works. Taking a bit of time. Copying files to final destination. Okay, so now these are all the files that were created by that build. I'm going to go ahead and double click on Snake Teacher Edition so I can play my game. Ooh, fancy. Made with Unity. All right, now I have my Snake game. And ooh, there's some sweet food down there. Oh, there's that one. Okay. So there we go. There's Snake. Fun, relaxing game that you can sit and play for hours as food, you know, pops into your screen and you get a little bit bigger every time you collect it. Now again, because we don't have a way to escape from the game, I'm going to Alt-Tab and then close the window. Now that your build is ready to go, you can right-click on the folder itself and click Send to Compressed Folder. It's going to zip all that project together, and you can turn in your zipped folder once you're done. All right, awesome. Hopefully you learned something new, and hopefully you are happy to be now building video games instead of writing all those writing responses that I had you do earlier. And hopefully you are excited about Unity and you're seeing the potential that it has to make some really cool games. All right. Have fun building this project, and I will see you next week when we work on our second power standard. And we're going to make something that incorporates some of your artwork. It's going to be pretty cool. All right. See you later.